Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern,
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
and last week the federal government announced it would be creating a design catalog for new builds. They would look into ways that they could fast track development, and that's something that Mike's been talking about for a while, so I wanted to find out. First of all, how do those design catalogs actually work?
So we can actually look to history for this. This was something that existed from about 1947 to 1977 or so, that the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation would issue these about once a year. And it would literally be like a catalog that a builder or developer or just average Canadian person you could get the catalog, you could look at a lot of pretty pictures of home designs, and if you saw something that you'd want to build, you could pay a little bit of money, go to the federal government, and actually get the blueprints for it. So back then, the designs tended to be, not exclusively, but tended to be small, single detached family homes. I think what they're likely to do now is have a wider variety of housing forms, but it's the same basic idea where you have these designs that architects have put together, and any Canadian could access for a nominal fee.
And so this would be for individuals who are looking to build, it's not for big developers?
So any absolutely anybody could take these things. So if a large builder or developer wanted to build tens of thousands of these across Canada, they could absolutely do so. But it kind of levels the playing field somewhat, where anybody can access these things and get those blueprints for very minimal cost.
I had heard that the architects there's groups of architects that have been speaking out against it, that didn't like it when the city of Kelowna had looked into doing this. Why would this be something that architects don't like?
Well, I don't really want to speak for them too much, but I can, talk about the potential downsides or ways that governments could get this wrong. One of the ways to get this wrong is that, first of all, that you need to have these blueprints, you need to have these designs in place, and we have to make sure that the federal government or municipal government is actually paying architects a decent fee for their services. So I think that's one of the first issues. The second issue is that you need to have a diversity of designs, that what works in one geography might not work in another, and to the very sort of micro level, where you're considering things like soil conditions, or let's say you have a house design that has built-in solar panels. Well, whether or not your lot faces north or faces south is a really big deal when it comes to those things. So making sure that you have those. And then finally, there is a risk that if you don't have a diversity of designs, that you can create a bit of a monoculture of a bunch of homes that look the same. And that's,
You kind of
often
do that
not.
anyways, no?
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, I've been in many neighborhoods where you have a developer who built 300 homes, and it's basically based on four different designs that the customer can choose from. So, I mean, that's already an issue, and I think there are legitimate concerns about that. Actually, I would add a fourth one as well, that because these designs historically have been for single detached homes, I actually think there's really a legitimate concern that this could lead to additional sprawl, right? That if we're just helping people build more single detached homes, then we're building out rather than up. So I do think architects have some very legitimate concerns. I think those can be addressed in the design of the program, but the federal government does need to address them.
Yeah, I saw that they had said that they were looking at starting it with multiplexes, student residences, and senior residences. So, like, how how much of a variety of forms do you think that they're likely to have? Are we talking like there's a dozen, 100? Where do you think it'll land?
Yeah, well, I'm hoping that it's in the hundreds, and I think this will have to be a process that is sort of added to over time, where maybe in 2024 they have a few dozen different designs, and then every year they add to it to create additional diversity. But there are some areas that I think they should particularly focus on. An obvious one is fourplexes. We've seen the federal government work with municipalities to basically legalize fourplexes, make them be able to build them as of right. There aren't a lot of fourplex designs out there, particularly if you're a smaller builder. So I think that could increase uptake. Student residences is an obvious one, is something that I talk about a lot, that we don't have enough student housing. And another one would be mass timber, particularly, let's say, like a six-story apartment building. We need a lot more of those, but we also, don't have that many builders and developers who are used to dealing with mass timber as part of their construction. So this might be a way to lower the barrier to entry. For someone who might have built 3 or 6 story apartment buildings, but using more traditional methods. This might encourage them to try something new.
Yeah, when the Ontario government announced that they were going to allow triplexes across the province, one major criticism I had heard was that the other parts of the plans, like about the floor space index, about all these different parts of designing the home, weren't being changed in a way that actually made them feasible. And I was wondering how much zoning will stop these homes from actually being built. Like, do we need these municipalities to largely change a bunch of their zoning rules in order to make the federal government's plans work?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways that this can fall down. The first is zoning, and that goes beyond the catalog of designs. That actually goes to the heart of the housing accelerator and what the federal government's trying to do. That, let's say a municipality says, okay, you know what, we're going to allow fourplexes as of right, but we're also going to institute a rule that every unit needs to have a dedicated parking space. So therefore, you need to have 4 parking spaces on the lot. Well, that's going to largely make the fourplex uneconomical, where you, unless it's a very large lot, you might not be able to put it on and have enough spots for parking. So there's all these other little rules that could stop, whether it be a fourplex, 6 story, mass timber apartment building, all of these things from getting built. The other one is the building code itself. And I remember our conversation with Minister Collin in BC, where we talked about single egress stairs, which I think a few people got really, really excited about. And, everybody else we may have lost. But that's going to be a big deal, particularly if we're trying to build more, 6-story or 12-story. Well, maybe not 12, but it could be 12, 6-story or 12-story apartment buildings. If we're trying to build more of those, then that might be difficult using the sort of more traditional dual staircase type methods. So that's one of the really important things to understand, whether it be the housing accelerator or the catalog of designs, that it only works if you have the underlying conditions and you change a bunch of other stuff as well.
So this is really like a one small part of getting more supply in the market. It's not an affordability measure in itself, right?
Well, I mean, it can be, but you certainly need to have a lot more supporting conditions. But it can drive affordability. So one of the big issues is that time is money, right? And we all know that. And the federal government is talking about this catalog as being pre-approved designs. And we should be clear about what we mean by approvals there. So, we've seen some commentary on Twitter saying, well, it doesn't really help with, site planning approval, site approvals at the municipal level and things like that, which is absolutely true. But where it really does make a difference is if a builder is going to the CMHC to get finance and insurance on a program like MLI Select, having the design out there can really fast track the process. So there can be cost savings. Another way there can be cost savings is if these designs are made in such a way that they're simple to build, they're not particularly labor intensive, and if you have those builders and developers building them, over and over again, you get that kind of learning by doing process. You
The
speed things
economies
up.
of
You can
scale too, right?
economies of scale. Yeah, absolutely. And another way, so there are actually a lot of ways that can. I keep thinking of more and more. There are a lot of ways that can lower costs. One of the other ways is that you can incorporate new technologies in there. We've already mentioned mass timber, but things like panelization. If those are incorporated into the design, then it creates a market for those products. Manufacturers start making more panels or whatever is in the design. And again, you get that learning by doing economies of scale, and then the actual components that go into the house, you start to see their prices get lowered as well.
I guess if they're trying to do multiplexes specifically with this, it's trying to reach out to those kind of the millennials like me who's like, I'm willing to sacrifice space so I don't have to commute in from outside the city. But I wonder how big of a role it'll play. Is that a big enough cohort that people are willing to live in these smaller multiplexes, these prefab multiplexes, instead of getting a one of those, like, compared to what they were building before with those single detached homes in the post-war efforts.
Yeah, no, I think it can make a significant difference. Again, if it's coupled, particularly if it's coupled with building code changes and that kind of thing. That I really do think there is a large untapped market out there for 3 bedroom or even 4 bedroom apartment buildings that just haven't been built for a variety of reasons. Again, building code is one of the obvious ones. I really think that this catalog could help accelerate the building of those things, where you have a couple, it could be a young couple with a child or an older couple who, wouldn't mind being in an apartment building, wouldn't mind having a place that didn't have stairs, but maybe want a third bedroom when the grandkids come over or things like that. So I do think there is an untapped market for larger sized apartment units that this catalog could help accelerate.
And when you have tiny shoebox condos that are just out of reach for most people, why would these kinds of homes be affordable?
Well, we should be clear that there are some things that this catalog can't do. This catalog is not going to lower the square foot price of land. So if you're building a 3 bedroom apartment building in downtown Toronto, I don't care your construction methods are. It's going to be expensive, right? Just because you're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe even to the seven figures, just for the land part of your apartment. So we should be very clear that this doesn't change everything. And affordability is a bit of a scale, but if we can figure out how to lower construction prices by 5 or 10 or 15%, that makes a meaningful difference. And then particularly if we can find ways to use our land more productively, so instead of building single detached or semi detached home, we're buying a fourplex. You're now dividing that land 4 ways instead of 2 ways, and that can really make a substantial difference.
A lot of the post-war homes that I see tend to be ones that people get as when they're starting out, and then a lot of them have been built up over time. So there's not a lot of these starter homes left. They've become much more expensive homes that are for bigger families and they're kind of disappearing, which is obviously needs to be replaced with more supply. But I keep wondering with this one, if this becomes a way that the government's encouraging lower end builds, what's stopping someone from just kind of building it and then eventually just expanding it to the point where it's no longer affordable?
Yeah, and I think this is where the actual designs are important. That I think this would be a failure if this were simply an initiative to build a bunch of single detached 900 square foot homes. Then people would absolutely do that. So you have to make sure that there is a market for these products. But we should also be clear that what the federal government here is doing is not actually building the homes themselves. And there's been some confusion about that because back in the 1940s, the federal government actually did that through the wartime housing effort. So, if there's a design in the catalog that just doesn't make economic sense, that builders and developers aren't going to build it. So I don't think there's much fear of that, but I do think that housing tastes and incomes change over time. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of stuff built now that 30 or 40 years ago is going to be heavily renovated into something else. But I don't think that has much to do with the catalog. I think that's just the sort of nature of housing.
Yeah, there's a whole episode to do for sure on starter homes and what's happened with them, because it's definitely, there's been big changes in the way that they've gone from different generations, and I see people don't like seem to move as much, so they tend to expand their homes more, and it's a whole other story. I wanted to read something from the Globe and Mail. The past president of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, Alan Taramura, called this plan naive and said, "Today, the situation is far more complex. Rural land adjacent to cities is largely in the hands of developers who have a pre established model for exploiting its commercial value, which does not include one off non market projects. Providing them with templates they can copy and paste into place is not likely going to change that. Inner city infill sites, on the other hand, are all unique and cannot be retrofitted with prototypical buildings. The simple duplication of more complex buildings across the country would already be standard practice if it was technically feasible, but climate, orientation, soil conditions, and the regulatory particularities of a site make outwardly identical buildings quite different beneath the surface." What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of truth to that, and I think that, there's kind of two poles to this argument here, where you've got people who are enthusiastic, and I kind of consider myself part of it. Pitching this as this is the thing that solves everything, and then you've got others going, well, this doesn't really solve anything because of these 37 other issues, and I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. That this is helpful, but there are these other issues, and I would actually agree that I don't expect the big subdivision developers. We won't name any of them, but we know who they are. I don't expect them to adopt anything from this catalog, and that's not what it's there for. I do think it's more, the sort of boutique, the kind of one-offs, and I would disagree somewhat on the infill side. That I think the point taken is a good one. That lots are significantly different from each other. But again, go back to the discussion we just had a few minutes ago about all of those cookie cutter homes built in the 70s and 80s. Those are the kinds of neighborhoods I could see this working in. And I do think, yes, you would have to take into account the soil condition. And again, is the house facing north or south if it's something with a solar panel on it? But I do think there are more opportunities here than that might suggest. And even if it's would only work on 5% of lots, that's potentially transformative, right? Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to what he says, but I think it might be overstated a little. Just again, like the like advocates like me might be overstating the benefits somewhat, just because we think this is such a great idea.
I guess it's one of those things where it's like anytime we have these new announcements on housing, I always hear people say, well, is that really going to solve it? And I don't think there's any one policy that could resolve it ever. I mean, I guess some people point out really capping demand is a way to do that, but that has all these other unintended consequences. So it's like, yeah, these are all little things that I guess we're seeing that could potentially work together to see big changes, right?
Well, absolutely. So, if you change immigration policy to bring in more laborers, then people will say, well, yeah, but land is so expensive that will make homes affordable. And if the federal government does something to on land, people will say, well, yeah, but who's going to build these things? We don't have the labor, right? So it's constantly this series of bottlenecks. And it was one of the things that we looked at when we uh, did the National Housing Accord and are working together report of trying to sort of figure out all the bottlenecks preventing us from hitting, whether it be the provincial housing target or the CMHC number we got into, and I think we identified about 36 different barriers, which we then put into 6 distinct buckets. There is no policy possible that simultaneously solves 36 problems. That simply doesn't exist. So, if we judge our housing's policy on, does it cover every single issue? No housing policy is going to be a success. There's always going to be something that doesn't touch, which shows that we need a suite of policies in order to address the housing crisis. That just these one-offs by themselves are never going to address all of the things that have gotten us into this mess.
Thanks so much for watching The Missing Middle. This was produced, as always, by the amazing Meredith Martin.
And please like or subscribe or leave a comment. It would really help us out a lot.
We'll see you next time.